Welcome again to the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, the Life podcast. This is our series I've entitled 66 Books, 66 short 5 to 10 minute podcasts taking an overview of the 66 books of our Bible. And today you've reached the last book of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, the book of God's expectations of His people. Malachi chapter 1 verse 1 says the author was someone called Malachi. The only Old Testament mention of him is in this verse, and it reveals nothing about him, not even his father's name. All that is known is that the Jewish tradition says that he was a member of the Jerusalem synagogue. Malachi is quoted a number of times in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 11, 14, 17, and in Mark chapters 9 and 11, and in Luke chapter 1. Also, the famous verse Malachi 3 verse 1 is quoted specifically in Matthew 11:10 and Mark 1 verse 2, and is also quoted in Romans chapter 9 verse 13. The meaning of the Hebrew word Malachi is messenger. Since a prophet was God's messenger, some have thought the term Malachi used in the opening verse is not a person's name, but a statement that the writer is a genuine messenger from God. However, the more usual understanding is that the writer, in calling himself Malachi, is introducing himself by his own name, just like all the other writings of the prophets. Who was the book written to? The text of Malachi itself gives no clues as to his hometown or even the king or kings who reigned during his ministry. Therefore, on the surface, an exact date is very hard to establish. However, 5 textual clues help us fix an approximate date. Firstly, the Edomites had been driven from Mount Seir, it tells us in chapter 1 verses 3 and 4, and they apparently had not returned, necessitating a date after 585 BC. Secondly, we see the remnant had returned and rebuilt the temple, and they were offering sacrifices. The temple was completed in 516, so the book must have been written after that. Evidently, we can see that many years have passed since the offerings were instituted, because the priests are declared to have grown tired of them, and corruption is said to have crept into the system. Also, the moral and religious programs in Malachi are quite similar to those faced by Ezra and Nehemiah. And then finally, the Persian term for governor, Pechash, is used in Malachi chapter 1 verse 8. All of these facts indicate that the book was most probably written during the Persian domination of Israel, which occurred between 539 and 333 BC. But the verses indicate that the governor at that time might have been bribed. That would hardly be Nehemiah, and Nehemiah returned to Persia in 433 BC. But came back to Palestine around 420 BC and dealt with the very sins described in Malachi. Therefore it is likely that Malachi proclaimed his message whilst Nehemiah was absent. All this leads to a date of around 430 BC. According to the book itself, the recipients were the people of Israel, and also particularly mentioning the priests. The remnant had returned to Jerusalem, and the temple had been rebuilt, but the people had become selfish and driven by their physical desires. They had also grown neglectful of their spiritual duties. Perhaps their interpretation of the prophecies of the exile and the pre-exile had led them to expect that the Messianic kingdom was about to immediately return. When that didn't appear to happen, they were perhaps therefore discouraged and becoming skeptical, as described in Malachi 2:17. This loss of hope in some sort of immediate divine justice had caused many of them to neglect both their faith and their devotion, and had been replaced with dispassionate religious routines. They had not been seen to relapse into full-blown idolatry, but a spirit of weary worldliness had crept in, and they were seen to be guilty of many immoral activities. So the message of the book is clear. The people apparently expected that because they'd come back to the land and rebuilt their temple, that they were going to enjoy the unlimited blessings of God. This did not prove to be so, and as a result the people began to doubt whether God really even cared for them. Malachi shows that the fault was on their side and not God's. They had by their sins and coldness created barriers that hindered the stream and enjoyment of God's love. The subject is then revealed by God making accusations against his people. The message being God rebukes sin in order to get his people to turn to him. The structure of Malachi is fairly straightforward. Malachi contains a series of 6 accusations that God makes against Israel. So after an introduction, there are 2 charges against the nation. First, that they have doubted his love, and that you have despised my name, he says. Then the charges are brought against the priests, where he says, you have disobeyed my law, and you have discredited my promises. And then charges are made against the people, where he says, you have defrauded my storehouse, and you have denied my blessing. Those main divisions are bookended with an introduction and a conclusion. So thinking about the purpose of this book, the purpose of Malachi is to rebuke the sins of the priests and the people in order that they would return to the Lord. To understand and appreciate the purpose of Malachi, it must be kept in mind that Israel had, in their very recent past, been steeped in idolatry. The exile had appeared to cure that. They were back in the land and the temple had been rebuilt. The problem was now lethargy and stagnation. Malachi denounces their indifference and the hypocrisy of the priests and the worldly marriages of the people and the Sabbath breaking, the lack of personal godliness, the failure to pay tithes, and their downright skepticism. The critical issue was that there appeared to be outward religious conformity by the use of the temple, but they lacked an inward heartfelt faith. Haggai and Zechariah had previously rebuked the people for failure to rebuild the temple, but Malachi comes along at the end of the Old Testament and rebukes them for neglecting the temple once it had been built. So in summary, as always, God rebukes sin in order to get us to return to him. Malachi rebukes the sins of the people and the priests in order that they would return to the Lord. Malachi is the only prophet who ends his book with judgment, which is a fitting conclusion to the Old Testament because it underscores God's solution in the work of his coming Messiah.